Tune into Nice Radio every Saturday at 7:30 a.m. for A View from the Outside, hosted by Brereton Horne. A View from the Outside takes a look at key issues affecting St. Vincent and the Grenadines and gives a global perspective on how these issues are viewed. Host Brereton Horne will examine a variety of topics to enlighten, stimulate debate, and explore solutions. Hear the facts, hear the real-life stories, hear A View from the Outside. Join Brereton Horne at 7:30 a.m. every Saturday on NiceRadio for A View from the Outside.
This society needs a spectacle. It might help us to see some evil. This society needs a spectacle.
Well, I was looking for Brereton Horne in the carnival action. Didn't see him jumping in any of the bands, but I know that he's got a whole lot of action in the United Kingdom. He's got the president, and that's a handful. Good morning, Brereton. How are you, sir?
Good morning, Randy. I'm good. As a matter of fact, I'm feeling amazing. How are you?
Yeah, it's a good feeling to wake up to, man. I got that good feeling this morning. But you've got a whole lot of demonstrations, a whole lot of stuff happening in your place, man.
Yeah, before I talk about that, I have a charge against you.
Okay, then.
I understand that last week you told people I have gone to the band, to jump in the band. And I've been getting calls from people saying, are you in St. Vincent? And you haven't told me.
Yeah, well, when I got it here, they told me they said you weren't going to be on. I said, figure that you gone in one of the bands and take a job.
Yes, so people thought I was in St. Vincent for Carnival, but there you go. I did enjoy some of it from a distance.
Yeah, it was a good carnival. It's everybody would have their little take, but what I've noticed is that a whole lot of people are into the private functions. There are a lot of private functions, and I don't think that the carnival per se, the shows at the park get the kind of support that they're supposed to get. But the private functions are well attended, and people seem to have had an enjoyable carnival.
Well, that's good, but in terms of the shows at the park and so on, maybe those who are in charge of Carnival need to look at marketing and everything else in terms of those shows, because as we know it, those are what make our Carnival, you know.
Yeah. And then I'm going back to the park on Tuesday. I know it was a late decision, but there are a whole lot of things that could have been done. They had sponsors like the lottery and float. They have a whole lot of giveaways, little gimmicks you could do to attract people, and with a small cost at the gate. So Carnival Tuesday could be something that we can capitalize and then do a whole lot much more than what we're doing.
Yes, of course. There's a lot of improvements to be made, and let's hope that those concerned are listening and they take some of the suggestions on board. But I'll come to you with the demonstrations in the UK. Yes, the President of the United States of America is in the United Kingdom, and there were hundreds of thousands, in fact, of people on the streets of London yesterday demonstrating against his presence in the United Kingdom. I'm sure you saw some of the images.
Came to the lady's house and disrespected her in her house.
and then try to turn it around in a press conference to say that it's fake news.
Yeah.
But there you go. That's what we're dealing with in this world, Randy. And we're dealing with it not just from the American president, not just in the UK, but around the world, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Major disrespect. Yeah, that's what's happening. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, good morning to you, and good morning to all of the listeners of Nice Radio, and to this program, A View from the Outside. In London, we have pretty good weather still continuing. We've had this similar weather over the last 4 weeks or so, and today it's partly cloudy, lots of sunshine around though. Temperature being 24 degrees Celsius, which is approximately 76 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm sure you're having good weather, although you didn't tell me.
Yeah, the temperature is relatively close to yours. We're a little higher. We're 26.5 degrees. It's a bit hazy, slightly hazy, but we've got a breezy Saturday morning, and we're expecting a few isolated showers. Looking good for a Saturday.
Absolutely. Let the amazing feeling continue. Yes, Randy, and listeners. On A View from the Outside this week being the 14th of July, 2018, we look at principle, P-R-I-N-C-I-P-L-E, principle, with the view being that St. Vincent and the Grenadines need more men and women of principle and with principle who are willing to stand up for the people and for the good of the entire country. The Oxford Dictionary defines principle as a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation of a system of belief or behavior or a chain of reasoning. And it goes on to say that principle is a rule or belief governing one's behavior. And an example of that would be he or she acted on principle. And the Oxford Dictionary goes on to say further that principle is morally correct behavior and attitudes. And in that regard, you can describe someone as a man or woman of principle. Today's focus would be on the latter two of those definitions. Today's program is inspired by an open letter to Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. This letter was written by Professor Gus John, an equality and human rights campaigner in the United Kingdom. Before we go into that letter, it is important to say a little about who Professor Gus John is. He was born in the village of Concord in Grenada on the 11th of March 1945. In 1964, he moved to England to further his studies in theology at Oxford University. It was during his time at Oxford that his awakening for social justice took place. Upon leaving Oxford, he became disgruntled and he split with the church because of the church's links with apartheid, that brutal regime which subjugated, suppressed, oppressed, and murdered blacks in South Africa. He then dedicated his life to campaign for social justice. And in 2015, his 70th birthday was marked by events honoring his 5 decades of activism in Britain. Now, back to the letter. The letter was Professor Gus John's response to an invitation which he received from Prime Minister Theresa May to attend a 70th reception, to attend a reception for the 70th anniversary of Windrush. The invitation was to attend the reception on the 23rd of June 2018. And the invitation said that the dress code was, in quote, smart attire. It is important to note that the invitation came after the fiasco in which many of the people of Caribbean origin were faced with deportation. Some were who were out of the country were not let back in. These people of Caribbean origin and their descendants were invited to the United Kingdom to help rebuild the country after it was left in ruins after World War II. They were referred to as the Windrush generation because the first group who came to the United Kingdom came on a ship called the Windrush. So, having spent over 50 years of his life campaigning for social justice and being aware of the Windrush fiasco, that fiasco being fresh in his mind, this was Professor Gus John's response to that invitation. And I read now the letter of Professor Gus John in full. Dear Prime Minister, it was with both surprise and utter bemusement that I received your invitation to the above. We in this country have become used to foreign heads of state and leaders of movements being made international pariahs and being refused entry to the United Kingdom. Robert Mugabe, Muammar Gaddafi, Louis Farrakhan, among others. In my book, Prime Minister, the policies of your government, the incitement of racial hatred that they undoubtedly represent, and the denial of fundamental human rights and the right to life itself to citizens of the Windrush generation who devoted all of their adult years to the development of Britain are enough to make you no less a pariah in the eyes of the Commonwealth and of the freedom-loving world than those whom your government over time has sought to ostracize. In July 2013, with you as Home Secretary, your government's own van were running around London boroughs and with large immigrant population and displaying huge billboards targeted at illegal immigrants, telling them to go home or face arrest. What is worse is that your government lied not just to illegal immigrants whom it wished to flush out, but to the public whom it wished to impress with its zero-tolerance stance on illegal immigration. 106 arrests last week in your area. It turns out that 106 was the total number of arrests across the 6 pilot boroughs in which the vans had operated over a period of 2 days. Arrests, not prosecutions or deportations. In your attempt to create a hostile environment for illegal immigrants, you placed 4 generations of Windrush arrivants and their descendants in the sight of any would-be defender of white Britain and its borders, including racists and neo-fascists, who felt they had a patriotic duty to help prevent Britain from being swamped by any means necessary, including murder and mayhem. On the 16th of June 2016, Jo Cox MP was brutally murdered in a street in her constituency by a white supremacist, Thomas May. Cox was unequivocal in her support for refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants escaping armed conflict, genocide, and hunger, and risking their lives in rickety boats to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. She was doing this in a country where the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, was forcing the 2 main parliamentary parties on the anger of the white British population at their failure to control immigration and reclaim Little England from the clutches and the legal strictures of the European Union, its Schengen Treaty, free movement of labor, and human protocols. Despite that horrific murder and all it said about Britain and its relentless conflation of immigration and race, the British electorate voted by a narrow margin to leave the European Union and claim back our country, or claim our country back. What is worse, both as Home Secretary and as the post-Cameron Prime Minister, you redoubled your efforts to create a hostile environment for immigrants, condemning long-retired workers of the Windrush generation to uncertainty, misery, hardship, and denial of the same life-saving health services for which they paid throughout their working life. It may well be, Prime Minister, that you would have the good grace to take the opportunity to tell your invited guests how sorry you are for your part in all of that brutal and inhumane and racist treatment of former colonized Africans who have and had no other interest than to serve this nation and to do their best by their communities and families. But one of the uglier manifestations of whiteness in this society is an unassailable sense of in-your-face entitlement. I do not believe that you are entitled to the magnanimity of those misguided folk who might well be happy to receive your invitation and to attend your Windrush anniversary celebration. As far as I am concerned, I stand with those who suffered detention, deportation, and mental ill health, some of whom even now face an earlier death as a result of being denied access to health services on account of your hostile environment or regime. It would be shameful. It would be a shameful betrayal of them to accept your invitation and to join you in Downing Street to mark the arrival of the Windrush 70 years ago and the contribution to British society of those whom it brought and their descendants. Invite me again, please, when you meet with civil society to discuss the findings and the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Reparation for African Enslavement, which you would no doubt waste no more time in establishing on the back of your government's Windrush scandal. Yours with sadness, Professor Gus John, Equality and Human Rights campaigner. So that's the response. It is clear from this response that Professor Gus John did not allow himself to be blinded by glitz and glamour. He was not going to forget the suffering and the difficulties experienced by his people just to associate with the elite. He stood on principle. It is worth noting here that in October 1999, Professor Gus John was asked by Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to accept a CBE, which is a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, in the New Year's Honours list of 2000. He refused. Upon refusing, this is what he said, I quote, "I had to decline because everything I have done in my life in this country since 1964 has been in the struggle for racial equality and social justice. One of the major impediments to promoting racial equality is the legacy of empire. Professor Gus John has certainly demonstrated what it means to be a man of principle and to stand on principle. It is therefore in that vein that we, on A View from the Outside, say that St. Vincent and the Grenadines need more men and women of principle and with principle who are willing to stand up for the people and for the good of the entire country. It is not principle to denigrate imperialism, the monarchy, and the Queen, and then jump and grab the opportunity to attend with glee a royal wedding. It is not principle to say that you are a man or woman of the people and then turn around and oppress the very people in every way. It is not principle to say that you are for social justice and then you are in bed with the oppressors and the dispensers of injustice. It is not principle to remain silent on the insufficient and inefficient health care in the country. It is not principle to remain quiet and not demand the conclusions or reports of the many investigations that were promised, including the investigation into the allegation of the selling of green cards and passports at the Vincentian consulate in New York, and the report into the investigation of the millions of dollars held in foreign bank accounts by members of the regime. It is not principle to remain as members of organizations that participate, even in silence, in the oppression of one's people. It is not principle to uphold a government or regime that refuses to be accountable to its people, a government that refuses to honor its obligations as dictated by the Constitution, the highest law of the land. It is not principle to sit quietly while the rule of law is being continually undermined. It is not principle not to speak out on the skyrocketing crime in the country. It is not principle to remain silent in the face of rape and sexual abuse of women and girls. It is certainly not principle to remain quiet while human trafficking is taking root in the country. It is not principle to remain silent on the many issues affecting the people and the country just to receive duty-free concessions. There is no doubt that many would say, and perhaps rightly so, that it takes courage to stand on principle. We, on A View from the Outside, say that if courage is what it takes, then the onus is on all of us to muster that courage and take it. Having spoken about apartheid earlier, it must be said that next week, the world, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, will be having the centennial celebration of Nelson Mandela Day. Many know that Nelson Mandela stood on principle against the apartheid regime, which caused him to spend 27 years of his life in prison in brutal and inhumane conditions. When we celebrate his centenary next week, let us remember the man of principle that he has demonstrated himself to be to the world. And let us emulate him and try to stand on principle, like Professor Gus John, irrespective of any real or perceived fear that we may have. And as we do so, let us have Mandela's own words reverberating everywhere. And this is what Mandela said, I quote, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." Until next week, Randy and all of the listeners, this is Brereton Horne with A View from the Outside, with a reminder to send feedback, as usual, to aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. That's aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. Have a pleasant Saturday, have a wonderful and enjoyable Sunday, and have a productive week ahead as we all endeavor to stand on principle. All the best, Randy.
Brereton, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.